This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan, and in for Amy this morning, Scott Bertram. He's the general manager of WRFH, Radio Free Hillsdale College, where we are broadcasting live again this morning. And Scott, Mark Zuckerberg is going to appear on Capitol Hill after all, in the wake of this Cambridge Analytica scandal and questions about Facebook's business practices. And, of course, this provided the occasion for Julian Assange to fire off a tweet the other day reminding people of just how little Mark Zuckerberg thinks of his product, which is you and me. Calling his users back in the day dumb fracks because they trusted him with their private information. Yeah, so if you ever need anyone this is from a text Snapchat exchange. If you ever need anyone you need info about anyone at Harvard, just ask. I have over 4,000 emails, pictures, addresses, SNS. How'd you manage that one? Zuckerberg, people just submitted it. I don't know why they trust me, quote unquote, dumb fracks. Yeah.
This kind of stuff's going to put a crimp in his presidential campaign, isn't it?
Yeah.
I like seeing pictures of him, in an Iowa corn boil, hanging out with the normal people, the farmers of America.
Sure, of course. I thought that Harvard commencement would be a real launching pad, but perhaps not. So Mark Zuckerberg before Congress, a lot of people want to get their meat hooks in this smug Silicon Valley CEO. And for more on the topic, we're pleased to be joined by Eric Lieberman. Eric is a tech and law reporter for the Daily Caller News Foundation. And Eric joins us now. Eric, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
So how much exposure does Zuckerberg and Facebook really have with respect to Congress? Is this more political exposure, or does it really translate into kind of economic viability exposure?
I would say most of the time that tech executives, which has been more so in recent years, are called in to speak to Congress. It doesn't really mean too much usually. It's more like a slap on the wrist. Let's show everybody in the country how much we care about their privacy, and we'll ask Mark Zuckerberg and other tech CEOs some tough questions, but they won't be able to answer. But what actual change that will come from that is not very clear. Having said that, this may be one of the few times where regulations may actually be considered. Europe is doing a lot of clamping down on big tech companies, and so while usually America is just talk in our political system about regulating these big tech companies, this may be the first time ever there's actually a chance.
I'm watching this, Eric, Scott Bertram, by the way, and I'm likening this to almost an NCAA investigation of a college basketball program, right? People are shocked to find out Facebook might be doing bad things with their private info. And now as the investigation continues, like a college team would fire the head coach or impose some self-sanctions, Facebook announcing this morning it's rolling out a centralized system for users to control privacy and security settings. Is this kind of thing going to be enough, or as you just kind of alluded to, are we looking at perhaps federal regulation of sites like Facebook, like YouTube, like Google, who thus far have avoided that kind of thing?
Well, I'm really wary of the idea of us having regulations over the tech companies like Facebook. Obviously there's some concerns with their privacy handling and their data management. But what did many users think was happening when we were giving in all this information to the social media platform? I look on my Android phone, and when I downloaded Facebook, it tells me right away that I'm giving in my text messages and call logs. I don't have to download Facebook. It's a free service. But at the same time, people may need to be more aware of what they're doing when they're giving up their data. Having said that, I don't think that Facebook will do anything with Mark Zuckerberg. I've had many emails from organizations around the country calling for the board to nix him as CEO, but he is the face of Facebook. He is not going anywhere. I don't know what kind of sanctions the company can impose on themselves. I don't even know what kind of sanctions the government can impose on them. the SEC, the Federal Trade Commission, is currently looking at it because they deal usually in the sphere. But at the same time, I don't expect much to come from this, at least as of now. As I said earlier, I think it's more just to show that for Congress to show their constituents that they actually, or they kind of care about how the tech companies use their data.
Yeah, and your point about, we agreed to this, which has been made, is a fair point. I agree with that. One thing that Victor Davis Hanson, though, writes about National Review, he kind of harkens back to the so-called robber baron era, although Burton Folsom wrote a good book about that was largely mythology. But nonetheless, where are the journalists, the Upton Sinclairs of the day, that are taking the big tech companies, the Apples and the Alphabets and the Amazons and the Facebooks, to task in a way that bad corporate actors a century ago were taken to task for example, inhumane working conditions? That where are the muckrakers of the left in the modern era?
Well, I don't mean to toot my own horn, but I do some great reporting on the big tech companies. For instance, Google launched a fact-check initiative on their platform, and I was able to prove that it was biased, and if not biased, their algorithms were faulty to make it appear biased. But you all do make a good point that there is not nearly enough skepticism around these big tech companies until right now. A lot of these big tech companies like Google and Facebook actually have great relationships with a lot of tech blogs and stuff. So a lot of them for years were more wary of criticizing these big tech companies because either they get financial support or they get technical support or they get organizational support. So you are correct that for a while these tech companies were given a pass in a sense. They were the darlings of America. They're the darlings of Silicon Valley. They could do no wrong because they contributed so much to our economy, and now people are seeing that comes with a cost. Having said that, I tend to err on the side that these tech companies do a lot of good for us. Instead of asking for the government to step in, we should just protest with our feet and not use the service if you don't agree with what they're doing.
Let's talk a little bit about Cambridge Analytica, who's sort of kind of been the difference maker in terms of the scrutiny Facebook is now receiving. I mean, the Cambridge Analytica case gets more and more bizarre. It sounds like it should be part of the Russian collusion investigation. So whistleblower Christopher Wiley is suggesting that his predecessor at Cambridge Analytica died mysteriously in a Kenyan hotel room in 2012, suggesting that his predecessor was poisoned after a deal went south. This is the same individual who talked kind of openly and proudly about, another individual, at Cambridge Analytica talked openly and proudly about Cambridge using prostitutes and other, questionable tactics to try and compromise politicians who they were targeting. The Cambridge Analytica piece of this whole discussion about Facebook.
Sorry, what was the question?
Give us your take on the Cambridge Analytica piece of this whole, because this is Facebook as a political tool, and Cambridge Analytica's role in this as sort of a representative of a lot of these kind of digital investigative and marketing companies that use Facebook for political purposes.
Yeah, so as far as the conspiracy theories that have been thrown out there by some of the people involved in the situation, I don't really know. Actually, there's so much news surrounding this one company that there's so much information being thrown out there. So I'm not even aware that he said someone died in Kenya or whatever. As far as Cambridge Analytica's role in all this, I think it is worrisome that there are data companies that are so eager to find every little thing about us. But it's also not necessarily new overall. What is new is the tactics that they use to get it. I mean, a lot of people on the right have been arguing that, well, didn't Obama do this and everyone call it genius? Yes, Obama did it to a certain extent, but there was more transparency with what he was doing. Cambridge Analytica made it seem like when they're collecting people's data, they were using it for academic purposes. But academic is a very general word, but they were really using it to sell it for political purposes. And they were also violating other Facebook rules, like extracting information through friends So that means that the middleman, the friend of the friend, the one in the middle, isn't aware that he's giving up his friend's data. And so there are some similarities between what Obama did in 2012 and what Cambridge Analytica is now. But Cambridge Analytica, I would say, went a little too far and broke the rules that Facebook rightfully had in place.
And doesn't this dwarf anything that the Russians tried to do in terms of meddling with the election via Facebook ads?
I see. Russia, I think, is a little overplayed. Just like I think this whole Cambridge Analytica thing is a little overplayed. How much overplayed in the sense of how much it actually affected the election. Both Russia spent very little and actually got very little outreach relative to the trillions of content online. And you could say the same for this. They've made profiles of a couple 100,000 people. Eventually, they got information to some state millions. But at the same time, out of all the people and all the content that is online, I really think both of these situations were either already should have been aware that this was happening, and if not, then it's really not as big or not as expansive as many people think.
Eric, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook included, of course. Facebook's the big gorilla in the room. But the way that people use these sites, the amount of personal information they end up sharing via pictures and via, I'm going on vacation and I'm going here and there and everywhere, does this rise to a level, these allegations, these revelations rise to a level where you think it actually will get people to change their behavior? Do they care enough?
I think people care a lot, but does not outweigh there's a feeling that they need to have these kind of things, these kind of apps and services. Because if they don't, then they're like, well, all my friends are on, and I like communicating with them. So I think a lot of people will sacrifice knowing that tech companies have their data, have their tendencies, their patterns, their trends, if it means they can communicate and use the social media services. A lot of people argue that the problem is Facebook's so ubiquitous. How can I not use it when everyone else is using it? I understand that notion, but at the same time, if you don't believe what a company is doing right, the best way to get them to stop is by not using their service rather than trying to ask the government or threaten them with regulation. So I think people will keep complaining about what these tech companies are doing, and I think for the time being, no one is really going to change. The usership of these apps, I think, for these tech company services is not really going to change, at least yet, unless more and more scandals and apparent missteps and embarrassments keep happening. I'll say maybe in the year after, let's say, 3 more scandals happen, then maybe there could be a tipping point. But I don't see it that yet, because people love social media too much. So
if significant attrition is not in the offing in the near term, what do you think it was that brought Mark Zuckerberg to the table in terms of testifying before Congress?
Well, I thought his response was very interesting. This is not many people notice this, and I've written about this. This is what he typically does: is he makes an apology, but at the same time as sounding contrite, he also gives reasons for why people should not be so upset. They're subtle, and they're often at the bottom, and he'll have his most remorseful statement towards the top. And at the bottom, he says, like when on Yom Kippur, the Jewish holiday of atonement, he apologized for having people misuse his platform, in this particular case, Russian operatives. And he apologized. And at the bottom, he said, well, it was only $100,000 spent, and it was very limited relative to the rest of the platform's ecosystem. So I think that a lot of people will, like you said, significant attrition will happen, and I think eventually people like Zuckerberg will have his back against the wall, which he kind of has now, and then people will ask, well, maybe I shouldn't, maybe in a year or two now. I think Zuckerberg agreed to it now because there's so much hysteria around this, especially from the left, and their calls seem to be a little more louder than other people on the right or the center that don't think this is as huge of a deal as everyone else does.
He is Eric Lieberman, tech and law reporter for the Daily Caller News Foundation. Eric, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer.